Well, we're talking about morality, aren't we? And I'm interested in moral arguments that have been presented. And Peter, I have a real problem understanding what your moral argument is. I think your argument is a definition of. So you began by giving us a definition. I mean, essentially your argument is that the unborn child is morally the same as the child or any other person. That's the essence of your argument. That is an assertion. And you backed it up with definitions. So you began with the Oxford English Dictionary, and then you took what other learned people had said, just to support your point of view. But where's the argument? You see, it's all assertion based upon a definition of how you understand, or what you understand the unborn child to be. Now, everyone can pick fault with anyone who presents a moral argument, but at least I'm presenting a moral argument, by which I mean she connected with some reality. She didn't just base her argument on any sort of definition. And by reality, I mean, I would urge you to think, if anyone who wants to present a moral argument has to engage with what humanity is, what does it mean? What does it mean to be an unborn child? What is the essence of an unborn child as compared to the actual born child? There are undoubtedly differences, and it seems to me your argument just elides completely those distinctions, which is why I actually think Ann's argument about petri dish. There's many others we could have talked about. The woman who's been raped, the woman who knows she's going to have a severely disabled child, the woman who generally can't cope. All of those rather extreme examples, it seems to me, are interesting examples because they force your argument to connect with reality. And of course, you just completely disregard them because you begun with your conclusion, which is to say that the unborn child needs to be treated exactly the same way as any other child.
Yes, I had a question for Anne. Actually, Anne, I found your argument quite confused because on the one hand, you said how human beings have special status, you were at one point talked about how abortion is in a way a sacrifice. That we have to sacrifice the unborn child. I thought you were going down the Naomi Wolf sort of argument. And then, on the other hand, you said actually that the unborn child is lacking in many things. And you were talking about how, the mother is, she has agency and she's self-aware and she has a sense of biography. And I wanted to know at what point do we have that? Because as Peter pointed out, Peter Singer made the logical point that if the unborn child can be killed, then so can the newborn child, because the newborn child is not self-aware. And I would say, at what point during childhood do we become self-aware? I just wanted to tell you the story. When I was about 5 years old, I was told to make a portrait of myself. I drew myself with pale skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. The reason why I remember that is because my parents, for some reason, kept this painting. I remember that is what I truly thought I looked like when I was about 5 years old. So did I have a sense of biography at that point? Was I self-aware? Did I have a sense of agency? No, I didn't. I was 5 years old. Now, was I fair game at that point? Could I have been killed? At what point do we become human according to your terms? Now, Peter has used definite, concrete definitions, but unfortunately I was a bit disappointed by your argument because I felt like it was according to Anne, according to my conscience. Well, if I'm going to act according to my conscience, then I can do things that you're not going to like. And yes, they will harm you. And if we can all do that, then none of us are safe. And really, that's what you're proposing.
Yeah, I'd like to reinforce the point that front over here about Peter starting this conclusion and then seeming to kind of analyse that from another conclusion. I won't go on that, that's not really made. Peter, at the start of your speech, you were talking about, during your definitions, how you now call the fetus a potential human, but a human. And then you went on to give your argument about how the fetus has a kind of inherent sense of rationality, although it might be able to manifest itself at that stage. And it's that point not being able to manifest itself which kind of made me think that by doing this you're actually masquerading potentiality even though you said at the beginning that you don't want to talk about potentiality. Because you're kind of acknowledging that, right, humans might derive their importance from their kind of sense of rationality, their self-awareness, etc. And then maybe acknowledging that perhaps the fetus might go on to become one of these people. And then you're kind of really inferring that might have something to do with the fetus at that point. You're inferring rationality from man itself to the fetus. And I can really see that leap there. The only reason I can kind of think that you might be explaining that, the way you might be explaining that is through looking at potentiality. So I'd kind of like to see how you can reconcile the two without referring to this potentiality.
Okay, I'll come here.
Right, so I don't really agree with Peter, but let's concede that there is uncertainty and controversy about this.
Okay, I'll come back to the panel to pick up any points that have been raised, and then we'll come back out to take some more questions. Peter, do you want to start off?
Okay. The idea that I've started my conclusion is nonsense. There is the argument. It's right there in front of you. Premise 1, premise 2. The conclusions follow from the premises, and I backed up the premises. You don't like the premises, then argue with the premises by all means. If you disagree with them, if you find them flawed in some way, challenge them individually. But to claim that I started my conclusions is just obvious nonsense. The reason why I use the argument that I have, this is not a matter of DNA. DNA was often mentioned, so what Anne was saying, so what has been said. This is an argument from DNA. This is not a gratuitous, speciesist, look, we've got human DNA, isn't that great, and therefore aren't we special? It's a metaphysical argument from the kind of beings that we are. I said at the very beginning, if you're going to determine or discern or argue the moral status of anything, you have to first define, not just define, but actually argue and prove what the nature of the thing is in the first place. And the reason why we as human beings are special creatures, unlike other animals, we have this kind of nature, and this is the point that this might go to the point that the chap back there made. I'm not arguing that this is a potential human being. This is an actual human being. It is a human being, but within the nature of that human being has inherent potentialities of reason and free will and all the things that make us persons. And because those things are the things that lead to a personal life, that rational nature that gives us reason and free will is therefore a personal nature. And therefore, whatever possesses a personal nature is a person. That's the argument that I have made. Now, you can engage with that metaphysical argument if you like, or you can not engage with that metaphysical argument. But it's an argument. It's not just a gratuitous assertion. I don't think, nonetheless, that the unborn child is equal in every single sense to every other human being on contingent rights. So I'm saying that the moral status of the human being, all human beings are equal, and therefore basic rights, including the right to life, which is absolutely basic, it's the most basic of all basic rights, is applicable to every human being. But, for example, people under the age of 18 do not have the right to vote. People under the age of 16 do not have the right to have sex or to do all sorts of other things. Weirdly, we can watch pornography before we can actually engage in pornographic stuff, but that's nonetheless. The law is an ass, but nonetheless, we have civil rights, we have these contingent rights, and yet we have also these natural rights, these rights that follow from our nature, and that is what we call human rights. And I have never heard an argument for human rights that can give us the kind of rights that we enjoy in as rational a way. Because the whole point of rights, and this is what I'll go to what you've just said right there, the whole point of rights is that they are deontological absolutes. They are absolute duties that the state and the rest of society have to everyone else, which means they are not contingent. They can't be violated because it suits us at some given point. And therefore, yes, I said in my contribution earlier on, I absolutely recognise the radical physicality of pregnancy, that I even recognise that pregnancy can be dangerous. But the point is that we do not get to violate the moral status and the rights of some human beings in order to gain even a radical benefit for ourselves. The rights are deontological absolutes. They are not contingent, and if you make them contingent, you deny their existence altogether. There is no point having a right if it can just be violated because someone else wants to. Rights are not geographically determined, they are ontologically determined according to the kind of beings that we are. That's the argument I've made. Deal with the argument, or don't, but don't deny that it's there.
Okay, Anne?
Yeah, but it sounds very smart, Peter, this kind of being that we are. But it seems to me that when you talk about the kind of being that we are, you're talking about the kind of being as we are, in the sense simply of looking at the species, the Homo sapiens species, the DNA, the whatever, because there's a certain point in what Jenny said quite crossly, which is that the kind of being an embryo is not the kind of being that a child is. And the kind of being that a child is not the kind of being that an adult is. And we do recognise that in the sense of progression, that it is possible to look at the rights and duties of those different stages of the development of the individual member of Homo sapiens in different ways. So, for example, we do not accord the child. We have specific responsibilities to children, and we have a particular way of dealing with children in a way that we don't with adults, because we realise that their capacity to do things is entirely different. And my point is that the only real commonality between the kind of being that an embryo is and the kind of being that an adult is simply really in their biochemical structure, because there's very little else that kind of crosses it. Now, on this sort of point about geography, the point really that I was trying to sort of explain in this is, which may have got a bit kind of lost in the discussion. Firstly, the point in which I was largely saying at the beginning that I do accord the embryo and the fetus a degree of moral status is not something that would be uncontroversial in my own area, actually. I think that you will find that a lot of people who come from my side of the debate would find that more controversial probably than anything that Peter said. But I do think that we can stand that. I do think that we can stand and we can stack that up with the fact that the moral status, that we accord a full moral status to the woman. And what I'm saying largely is that we can look at the moral status of these different entities in various different ways without necessarily compromising on any intellectual integrity in the way that we look at them. What I was trying to say is that if you try and accord the embryo, though, and you try and accord the woman the same degree of moral status, the same degree, and you accord that the same respect is due to them in the context of pregnancy, you are going to run into real problems where there is a perceived conflict between them. Now that's where geography matters, and that's where birth matters as a real point, because frankly, I think what you can say is that all the time that the embryo is in the woman, all the time that the fetus is in the womb, you cannot talk about the moral status or the moral rights that you accord it as though it is entirely in abstract, because it isn't. Once you've passed the moment of birth, nothing magical may perhaps change as it passes to the embryo or the fetus as it passes through the birth canal. I don't believe that there is some magical transformation that takes place with that first intake of breath as regards the fetus. But one thing for sure transformative happens in relation to the woman, and that is the fact that you can then take decisions, you can then act in a way towards that newborn in a way that does not necessarily impact on her, because intervening in the life of that newborn child can be done without in any way interfering with the physicality of that woman. And that's really why the moment of birth, to me, makes a huge amount of difference. It's because of the relationship that exists to the woman once that child is born. So in the same way that the embryo in a Petri dish is different to the embryo in utero, so the newborn child, to an extent, is different from the child in utero. It's kind of standalone. Now, does that mean therefore, that what we can do with it changes. You know, you've made the point that from the moral status of the fetus, and I've argued many, many times, Peter, and you've heard me, that I don't really accept that morally there should be a time limit placed upon abortion. So you'd ask me then, do I believe in infanticide? And so on. I do think that there is something that is problematic that basically says that there can be no intervention to end the life of a child once it has been born, simply on the basis of the moral status that exists of that child. Now, I have seen people late in pregnancy wrestling, having been given a diagnosis of fetal abnormality, and finding it very, very difficult to make a decision about whether or not they end the life of their child before birth, or whether or not a decision could be taken that if the child were so severely handicapped as to make its life utterly miserable, that no intervention could take place afterwards. And I have to say that it's the one thing that I do have a huge amount of sympathy with Peter Singer's arguments, that basically we should perhaps look at some of these things a little more in the round. But that's got nothing to do with the discussion about abortion. It has got to do with the moral status of how we look at newborns. And I do think that that is not entirely detached from how we look at the moral status of embryos and fetuses. But the one thing that we can say is that it's not the same as talking about pregnancy, and so it's not the same as talking about abortion. I think, you know, to address your point at the back, the fact that you could draw a picture of yourself with hair and so on, the fact that you can draw at all, I do think speaks to the point that you do have an image of yourself and an ability to do stuff which differentiates yourself. It might be very confused, but nevertheless, it is a sense that you are at least human and you are at least alive. And I do think that it's very, very difficult to equate that with what your consciousness would have been when you were in your mother's womb.